Judges 7 and 8. It is, some of it's very familiar, some of it's not familiar at all. And what it's going to be kind of looking at here would be the idea of getting credit. And you won't see it from this picture yet, but it will come and make sense in a moment. I would ask you this. Have you ever experienced a moment where something really great happened? Maybe it was an accomplishment, or it was like a good work well done. Something that, whoa, they stepped in and just took care of it. And the person who deserved the credit got the credit. Don't you love that when that happens? Like the person who did all the effort, all the work, even if they're like behind the scenes and they're like modest and they don't want the credit, but somehow it shakes out and everyone's like, yeah, well done. Doesn't that feel so good? That feels so, in a work setting, they say it's a really great way to boost morale, right? To make sure you give credit where credit's due. So it is really funny in my context to be like, man, Sue Link, great job. That person felt really welcomed when they came. Great job. You did that. You did that. Great job. It's fun to do that to Byron, to Kami, to Nathaniel, to Nick, to Rodney. It's fun. To Deb, to all of them. It's so fun to give credit where credit's due, right? I'll say it again. It is so fun, not just when credit goes to the right person, but to be the one in a position where, like, when everyone wants to heap praise on the person, whoever did that good thing, to be able just to completely deflect it and say, I know, isn't it great? It feels like all is right in the world when that happens, doesn't it? We are afforded that opportunity every day on a micro level, giving credit to people where credit's due. But also we're given that opportunity every day on a macro level, on a big level, to acknowledge God's working in his hand in our lives. And what we are afforded in that opportunity, we also experience something else that occurs, right? Whenever there is a situation where praise is wanting to be pushed on someone else, and maybe it's not us, something else is awakened, isn't it? It's called a kind of snare, but something inside us is awakened. It's like this, one of these little horrible monsters that you're like, man, I want credit to go where credit should, and I want to be the one to push praise past me to the right place, right? But there's that little monster. It's an age-old, savage, subtle monster that loves to convince us to, instead of pushing the praise on, to steal it. To clamor for the credit ourselves. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt that? Someone just clueless says, man, this was so good. Who did this? And you're in that moment like, well, I know who did. But quietly, you're like, well, I mean, they had a big hand, but you know, I helped them. I helped them out. And there's just that subtle taking of credit that isn't completely yours. And it like makes you sick. Like you take it and you don't feel like all is right with the world. You feel dirty. You feel ugly, but it's that constant temptation. And in a world where a lot is to be credited for everyone else, there is the everyday, every moment temptation to take credit. Another word for that is vanity. Today we're going to be talking about the snare of vanity. The word snare is listed in Judges chapter 8, but vanity is this clamoring for credit or for fame or for attention. Now, let's be clear. There are obvious expressions of vanity, right? I mean, you name a magazine, Vanity Fair, and it's just full of just vain people who just want attention, want to be remembered, want their outfit that they wore so good to be looked at, right? There's just obvious things like that. But we common folk, you know, we We look down on those obvious expressions of vanity in our life, don't we? Hopefully we do. We're past those obvious expressions of vanity. No. This is a story about the subtle, sophisticated expressions of vanity that even us common folk, us good moral folk, struggle to resist. That's what the story of Gideon's about. The snare of the subtle, sophisticated expression of vanity. Judges is about stopping the cycle of sin, learning about the cycle of sin. And what's so sad is Judges 7 and 8 is on the portion of the cycle where God is delivering his people. And in the midst of God's activity of saving his people, do you know what we experience? The dissatisfaction and the ugly reality that as God is forcibly the only one who should get credit for saving his people, we experience people clamoring for the credit themselves. It is awful, and it is ugly. One way to describe it is this: the subtlety of vanity is a snare that brings catastrophic ruin to the lives of those caught in it. To be free of this kind of snare is to give glory to God, giving credit where credit is due. This is kind of maybe the image that I want us to just walk through as we walk through these two large chapters. You're going to hopefully feel and see this kind of posture, and you're going to see that monster inside of us can be fed and it can grow. And hopefully you're reminded too that it is destructive in our lives. So the first place we're going to start is chapter 7. Remember, Gideon has been called by God, and God has kind of done the house cleaning issues of kind of cleaning him from unbelief. But now we get to the good stuff, and we kind of know this story. Judges 7 begins with Gideon, and all the people who were with him. They rose early. The camp of Midian was just north of them. In verse 2 it says this. This is just the simple thesis of this morning. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you, Gideon, all your army, 32,000 of the people gathered with you, you have too many. You have too many soldiers. You have too many warriors. The people with you are too many. Let's just process this. Can you ever really have too many warriors? Like, think of a battle where you're like, you know what? We just have too many. Like, what is going on right now from the onset? God knows you better than you know yourself. He knows us. He knows that monster inside of us better than we know ourselves. From the very beginning, God calls Gideon. I want to use you, Gideon. I want to share glory with you. But look at how he starts. Gideon, the people, all the warriors with you, they're too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Why? Well, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. What? There's too many. At the start of the battle, this is kind of what it looks like. The start of the battle, the blue is Midian. They have 135,000 soldiers. And Israel, Gideon, they start with 32,000. So already, if you just carve it out into a pie, you're like, what? Israel has too many? Whoa. So like, if they fight and Israel wins, God knows what's going to happen. Israel will brag about how great they are. Why? Because we just had too many. So that if they win, they could maybe twist the message like this. Oh man, we were outnumbered, but our guys killed like 10-1 and we won. Like, you've heard stories like that. Immaculate achievements. We're like outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Actually won. And you're like, wow, what What a great human achievement. God is explicitly looking at this and saying, even though I told you, Gideon, that I'm going to save my people through you, you and your people may twist this into a great achievement of humanity, bravery, courage. So what does God do? You have too many. I would think Midian has too many. But anyways, Israel has too many apparently. So verse 3, God says, hey, Gideon, let everyone who's fearful and trembling, let him return home. So they have 32,000 people staring at 135,000 people. How many do you think are afraid? Yeah, way more than half are afraid. Out of 32,000 Israelites, 22,000 of them up and leave. Why? Yep, I'm afraid. I'm out, right? They just like tap out. They leave. So they're left with 10,000. The pie distribution chart. That's what it looks like the odds now are. Verse 4, Lord says to Gideon, you still have too many. Like, what? All of a sudden you realize this actually isn't about winning, is it? I mean, we've like forfeited that long ago. You have too many soldiers. This isn't about you have too many soldiers in order to win. You have too many. You still, that inner monster inside of you, may still twist this into an incredible story of human courage and human achievement. Why don't we do a little experiment? You know, remember what the experiment is, right? God says, hey, let's have a water break. Remember 2-a-days in football in the hot summer sun in August? Water break, it was just a glorious thing in the world. And the football players would run over there, and there would be a lot of different ways the guys would drink. That's what happens. He's like, hey, your soldiers are kind of going to have two ways of drinking at this water hole. One, they're gonna put up their hands and lap it up like a dog, and the others, they're just going to kneel down and just drink right from the stream. It doesn't necessarily say which one is better than the other, but look at verse 6. The number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, was 300 men. The rest knelt down to drink. And so verse 7, the Lord says, those 300 men, with those 300 men, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand and let all the others go home. So then, after this, now, this is the odds. This is what it looks like. There it is. There's the odds. How many soldiers do we have? We have 135,000 Midianites. And we have 300 with Gideon. On the pie chart of percentage, Israel has 0.2% of the amount of troops that Midianites do. There's nothing fancy about this percentage, but apparently God looks at that percentage and says, yeah, if Israel wins, there's no way anybody could say this is a feat of human achievement. The only way that anybody will give credit if Israel wins is by saying, God must have done this. God must have done this. How do you feel about God securing for himself glory? Is he a glory hog here? Do you take issue with it? Do you do what a lot of skeptics do? And have the inner monster say something like this? Well, geez, God, everything doesn't have to be about you. You ever flirt with those kind of temptations? It's helpful to read Genesis 1 and 2 when you have those kind of temptations, and then you're reminded that God created everything for his glory. And the fact that his glory includes us being saved by his miraculous hand is not something to question him about. It's something to just absolutely enjoy. Now, what's interesting is God secures glory for himself by this reduction of troops, right? But the story, if you remember, there's a little bit more to this story. Because before we just go and see the 300 win, it says, verse 9, the same night the Lord said to Gideon, arise, go down against the camp, for I've given it into your hand. Verse 10, but if you're afraid to go down, go down to the camp with your servant. Hear what the Midianites are saying. What a weird thing. Like if you're Gideon and you have now only 300 troops, you probably are afraid a little bit, right? Even the most faithful, strong, courageous man would be like, I have 0.2% of the amount of troops against my enemies. Yeah, I'm a little afraid. So Gideon takes him up on the offer, goes down to the Midianite camp, and he listens. Verse 14. One of the comrades of the Midianite army answered this, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all his camp. And verse 15 reads like this. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, it says of the Midianite warriors, it says, then he worshiped. It's like he finally got it, right? The irony is this. We read in verse 9 that God promised to Gideon, we got him. God promised, God's word promises to Gideon that, yep, don't worry, we got him. You will win. I will win the victory through you, don't worry. But Gideon still is doubting, and so it takes Gideon to hear that same thing from the lips of a Midianite warrior in order for him to get it. Like, how miraculous of a victory does God have to do in order for us to grasp how he is worthy of all worship, of all glory, of all credit? Like, I think at this point, Gideon, when he hears this, is kind of like, all right, I can't claim anything for myself in this. Like, this is crazy. Why the Midianites would see a dream and then thus conclude that we're going to beat them is beyond me, right? So we know how this works itself out. Maybe we do. Maybe you've forgotten. Because if you remember, God secured that glory for himself by reducing the troops, but he also replaced the weapons. Do you remember this? This is so strange. So you think, man, those 300 warriors, they need like double the armor. They need not just any sword. They need like the double, the prong sword. They need unlimited ammunition. They need every weapon they could get. And then we kind of read through here. Gideon divides the 300 men into groups of 100 around the Midianite camp. And they go in the middle of the night. And it says in verse 19, the middle of the way through, and they blew the trumpets, and they smashed these jars that were in their hands. The three companies blew the trumpets, broke the jars. They held in their left hand the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, a sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon. That last phrase in 20 is really funny. A sword for the... We don't have swords. Like, just think about this. So these 300 men are broken up into three groups around the Midianite camps. And what are they armed with? They have a trumpet, right? Like a ram's horn. It's a little more manly than what I just did. But like a horn, right? Like a scary and whoa horn. And then they have a torch in the other hand. And they have a jar over the torch as they walk and get into place, right? So this is what happens. They blow the trumpet, they take the jar and they smash the jar, once again just making noise, and they hold up their torches. They hold them up high. Those are the weapons they had. And so what happens here? Verse 21, every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. Verse 22, then they blew the 300 trumpets. The Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled. Like, what is this story? Other than helping us see who is deserving of credit. Helping us from the onset have a kind of worshipful posture where we are bowed in reverence awe, saying, God, to you alone deserves all the glory, right? I mean, I love verse 15 where Gideon, it's actually the most pious, most positive visual portrait we have of Gideon, and it says he worshiped. Like, this is the best Gideon gets. This is the greatest display of his faith. This is probably why he's listed in Hebrews 11 as one of the heroes of the faith, right? At this moment, he has faith that God, you and you alone are going to give us the victory. And I can't claim anything. And yet, God still allows Gideon to be named as one who is full of faith in this scenario. I mean, he did go into battle and he did blow the trumpets and smash the jars. Like, wow, Gideon displayed some faith there. But who won? I think about this and I think our God deserves the credit for our life and how blessed we are and how grateful we are and how good things are for us. And maybe right now things aren't that great for you, but I just want you to pause for a moment and think, the Lord has won the battle. The Lord has won the battle that is your primary battle, and that is against sin. Victory has come because of God's initiative, because of God fighting, because of his strange strategy of the cross. You think some trumpets, some torches, and a jar is strange? Think about bringing to the battle of the demonic cosmic forces of Satan, bringing to the battle an old rugged cross and hanging on it and breathing your last. Talk about a strange strategy. Talk about a strategy that lends and leads us to worship the God who saves, who deserves all the credit. And by giving him credit, by deflecting all the credit to him, it seems as though all is right in our life, even when maybe things are wrong. Have you ever been there? When things are going, it's crazy, but you are reminded of the winning victory of Jesus Christ on the cross over your sin. And so things are still wrong, but you're like, all is right in life. That is the posture of worship that I would say we are to maintain and hold on to. Now, this is how the story begins, this particular portion of the Gideon story. Because then we slide into, as he's chasing out the rest of the warriors, we slide into Judges chapter 8, and we have this strange little scenario, and we see more and more of Gideon and less of God. A lot of God's activity in chapter 7. Now there's a little bit of pushing out, a subtle nudging out of God, of recognition of who God is, of acknowledging him, and just watch how this transpires. So the nation of Israel has been sinning against God, and we get to chapter 8, verse 1, and we hear about these men of Ephraim, and they question Gideon, and they say this to Gideon, "What is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely. Now jump up to chapter 7, verse 24. So when they smash the jars and blow the trumpets, the Midianites are like, "Ah!" And they run, and they scramble, and they're fleeing, right? And so Gideon sends messengers, it says, throughout all the hill country of where? Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites, capture them." He basically, at that point, right, after the whittling down of all of his troops, and the Midianites are fleeing everywhere, now he sends, "Okay, let's do the job. All the men of Ephraim, come with us now," right? Like, they are to take part in the victory. Like, how awesome is that? And what do we have here? We have the men of Ephraim being like, "Call us in at the last minute. Why weren't we there at the beginning?" Like, what? Like, they feel snubbed. Like, have you ever felt snubbed out of some credit? Have you ever felt like, I should have been brought in earlier? I probably could, we would have had more of a part. Have you ever felt snubbed? You haven't been in on it from the get-go, and as a result, you've lost out in some way, shape, or form. And you are super, super sensitive to this. Gideon here, I think, is a little bit surprised, and he diplomatically calms them down to where their anger against him by verse 3 is subsided. But what we have here is we have vanity in the midst of victory. Isn't that interesting? Like, they feel snubbed, even though, like, they're just mowing down the Midianites, but there's still something not quite right. What is it? Their ego. It's their pride. It's that we didn't get all that we could have in terms of credit and fame and honor and riches and wealth, and they are offended by it. They think they deserve more. I don't like it either. It's ugly, isn't it? That little monster has caused them to, rather than worshipful, kind of bend in towards themselves a little bit. You feel that? We see also that Gideon does something unique. So verse 4, Gideon is chasing these two kings of Midian. And he's exhausted and he's pursuing them, verse 4. And so he says to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people. This is verse 5 with me, chapter 8. Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I'm pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. So the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? So they're like, no, we're not really going to help you. I don't even know if you really got him or not, Gideon. So Gideon says, well then, when the Lord has given these kings into my hand, I'm going to come back and I'm going to flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Holy smokes. Verse 9, the same thing to this other group of men. He says, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. So they kind of are like, I'm not going to help it. We even question if you are really going to get those kings. And so what does Gideon do? He just curses them and says, oh, you will pay for saying anything against me. Like, have you ever seen that in our cultural context? A person who's hypersensitive about having anything said about them, right? A lot of things are lofted around, and how much do we say? You got to have duck like a skin like a duck, right? It's got to just fall off you. Just let it roll off. How much rolling off is going on in our culture? It's just a war of words. We just banter and yell at each other, right? We feel this thing of Gideon. We're like, he's kind of slighted. He's questioned. Gideon, I don't think you're going to get those kings. And what does he do? Oh, I will take you out when I do, right? And he does. This is what's so scary. He doesn't just come back and grab briars and whip their skins and make them bleed. He doesn't just tear down the tower that he says he was going to. Look here in verse 17. It says he broke down that tower he said he was going to. Verse 16 says, yeah, he took the thorns and whipped them. But then at the end of verse 17, he went ahead and killed the men of the city. So God just gave Gideon this incredible victory over the Midianites. And they're fleeing. And while Gideon's chasing them, he's promising to come back and kill anyone who questions him. Why is he so offended? Are we easily offended? Are we easily offended to where we will come back tenfold? We will reject the verse in 1 Peter that says, do not repay evil with evil. But no, we will up the ante and we will come back and pound anyone who wasn't there for us, who maybe questioned us. Hypersensitive. But it even gets worse. Gideon finally gets these kings. You can see in verse 18 here. And they begin to talk back and forth with Gideon. Obviously, they're defiant. Look at verse 20. Gideon says to his firstborn Jether, rise up, young man, and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Think back to where God called Gideon. Where was Gideon? He was hiding in the winepress, threshing wheat. He didn't yet know violence. He didn't yet know revenge. He was a lot like Jether, wasn't he? Jether here is held up as a positive example. The two kings in verse 21 just goad Gideon some more. Oh, you're a man, you should do it. Don't make your son do it. And what does he do? Gideon rises up and kills him. But more, he took the crescent ornaments that were around their necks of their camels. A sign of kind of becoming the king, becoming the conquering hero, the conquering warrior. Gideon now has become what he thought never would become, right? Victorious, but in a really bad way. Remember, he was that fearful, reluctant warrior that God saw might in, and now that might has been twisted into vengeful wrath, clamoring for credit and power and fame. I wonder if he's hypersensitive about his reputation and being remembered for someone great. He's been questioned. I wonder if now he's fighting for his personal agenda to leave a mark, to be remembered. It wears ugly, doesn't it? It wears ugly. The last part of the passage, it's a short 5 verses here. Verse 22. In response to all of this, it says, Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Pause real quick right there. Wow. Like what a twisted turn of events, right? So the people apparently forgot the odds that were in place when the war began, right? When the battle began. And they are just latched on to Gideon. And maybe they're out of fear. They're like, we don't want to get killed either. He's kind of crazy. He's a tyrant. So let's just, Gideon, you'll be our king. We know we'll be protected then, right? He'll just kill anybody. I don't know. But they kind of are jumping to give credit and to place credit in the wrong place. Gideon, you're the one who gave us victory. And may we dare not do that. May we not give credit to the wrong place, to the wrong person, to the wrong being. But then Gideon, what does he do? The obvious temptation in front of all the people, what does he do? He kind of does the right thing, right? He does what any of us would do. When it is an obvious temptation of, wow, you are great, we would never audibly say, I am. Right? We would never do that, would we? That's too obvious. So Gideon passes the test of the obvious temptation. But look at verse 24. And this is where I would say you see that image up there. You see how this now has developed. Verse 24, Gideon said to them, but let me make a request of you. So he's like, oh no, I'll never rule over you as king. I'm not great. But there is one thing you could do for me. There is something that you could give me. There is some way which you could give me all the credit, right? So listen to his idea. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. They've gotten golden earrings. And they answer, of course, we'll give them willingly to you. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earnings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 43 pounds. 43 pounds. Wow, that's a lot of golden earrings, right? He took crescent ornaments and pendants, purple garments worn by the kings of Midian. He took all the spoils, and he didn't just take it and hoard it and Scrooge McDuck, like just swim in money. He actually makes it into an ephod. He puts it in his city. And then it says this, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. And listen to how sad that ends, verse 27, and how anticlimactic verse 28 ends this cycle. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon, right? Like it ends with just this thud, just this ugly, awful thud. It should have ended with like, God rescued Gideon and Israel from the hand of the Midianites. It should be like, wow, what did God do in worship? Wow, God, you are amazing, right? It should have ended that way. And instead it ends in like, well, God gave the victory, but Gideon wanted all the credit. And he's this hunched back, spiritually speaking, ugly man who's just saying, I deserve a good amount of the credit here. And he's ugly. And God is still gracious and gives him 40 years of rest. But it's like we won, but we won in the wrong way. Have you ever felt that lack of satisfaction? When you've won, but you've won the wrong way? Let's say you've played a board game, right? And you have cheated the whole game, and no one has caught you. And when you're not getting caught, you're like, woohoo! Woohoo! This is so fun! And then the game ends earlier than what it should have because you've been cheating, but no one caught you, right? And so it ends, and they're like, wow, how did you do that? And you're like, well, I'm just good night, lucky night, roll the dice, And they're just like, keep heaping praise on you. And you're like, all right, it wasn't that great, And they're like, no, it was the fastest time anybody's beaten us, And it's just this awkward of like, hey guys, let's play again. And you almost want to purposefully lose so bad because it feels so ugly taking all of that credit. Maybe you eventually fess up and say, I cheated. That's why I won so fast, And they're like, oh, you despicable human being. Gideon ends in that strange tension. Gideon is the perfect example of what Augustine, in about AD 300, used the Latin phrase incurvatus in se. It means that our nature is bent in on itself. We forget it. It means that we are curved in on ourselves. Our natural disposition is to get credit for ourselves, is to steal and clamor for fame and credit. We take it from people, we take it from God. God knows that. That's why in chapter 7, verse 2, he's like, you have way too much. That's why God purposefully reduces the troops and replaces the weapons so that Gideon can have a moment of clairvoyance and see that it was him, God, all along, and stand in his heart disposition to saying, God, you alone. But here at the end, he's like the ugly hunchback. And this is a tale of warning for us. It's a tale of tragedy. Now, I will say this. Through the work of Jesus Christ, there is hope. That's the second phrase down there. It's another Latin phrase. It was used by Martin Luther, working from Augustine's work, over 100 or over 1,400 years later. It's a Latin phrase that means we are simultaneously righteous and a sinner. We feel that tension in our life. This is a tension I don't want to shy away from. It's like when you go to the doctor. Like this past week, I brought my son to the doctor who was sick with an ear infection. We went into the doctor. He said, yep, you're sick. You're sick. And he prescribed us with some medicine, and he gave us his word. He promised, but you're going to be fine now. You are going to leave here and start feeling better. So we go home, we get the prescription, and I give my son one dose of the medicine. And I ask you this, at that moment, is my son sick? Or is he well? He's both, isn't he? My son is simultaneously sick, but he's getting better. He's being cured. And our hope is that he will one day be healthy. Why? Because the doctor has pronounced and promised us that he's going to get better. And for you and I, in our life, we are going to have to fight this credit monster inside of us that curves us in towards ourselves our whole life. But there is this guarantee from our doctor from on high who says, you will be cured one day. My son will come. And that disease, he will rid you of it. And you'll be free. And heaven is this picture where the inward curve is gone. And it's this green outward curve. That's the promise of the disposition in the future. And this tale pushes us to be like that, to hold on to that. Maybe one last illustration to think about it. Maybe to encourage you. Have you ever been to a trout pond? I used to love going to these growing up because it was one of those things you go to. Fishing isn't always fun because you don't always catch fish, especially as a little kid. Dads, if you have little kids and you want to train your kids to like fishing, go to a trout pond. Do not go to Harrison Lake. It is difficult to catch fish there. You have to fish there your whole life to get a little baby bluegill. It's like, this is too hard. Go to a trout pond where they can see the fish, and the fish are like clamoring for the bait. You know, they're like, I want. And the kid's like, before it even touches the water, he has one on. Now, they're all disease infested and stuff, but that's right, just throw them back, right? But have you ever gone to a trout pond and not caught one? Have you ever gone to a trout pond and you're like, whoa, there's fish everywhere, and and you're like, I'm just reeling this in and I'm going to get one. And you reel it and you get nothing. You like swing it right by the face of the fish and he doesn't take it. So you put like 6 worms on a treble hook on the back of a spinner, right? So you're like, there's no way a fish can resist this thing, right? And you just get nothing. What's the issue? They're full. They apparently have been fed recently. Their appetite has been satisfied. They have feasted, and even the best looking lure or bait or snare has no pull on them. It's in that moment they have the clairvoyance of, I've had my ripped off by one of those things before. I'm not going after that. I've experienced the consequences of, oh no, sir. We'll let that pass. There's this story where right before Jesus began his ministry, Satan came and tempted him. And do you remember what Satan tempted Jesus with? Vanity. It's a snare of vanity that Satan had grabbed and ripped lives apart with countless times before from humans. Seems they can't resist the snare or lure of vanity. He drug that bait and that snare across Jesus' face, and Jesus did not bite. That snare had no pull on his heart. That same snare was far less obvious later in Jesus' life, before his death in the garden. Remember in the garden? What was he tempted with there? Vanity. Jesus, you don't have to go through the cross. You do not have to suffer. You don't have to. Far more subtle, far more sophisticated. He resisted Satan, the temptation, the obvious one in the desert, and that was hard enough. Angels had to tend to him. Here in the garden, he resisted it, but it took sweat like drops of blood, fervent prayer. But he said, Lord, not my will, your will be done. Not me, but you. Not me, but you. Vanity is a subtle but strong snare. Does it have a hold on you? Like Gideon, are you able to resist the obvious temptation to take what is obviously not yours, but maybe you're like Gideon to where you struggle to resist the subtle, sophisticated temptation to undermine others when they're superior to you in some way. Ever been tempted to do that? Someone's a little better than you? So what do? Instead of congratulating them, you undermine them. Maybe you clamor for seemingly excusable perks if they're offered to you, even though you really don't deserve them and it just isn't right. That's really subtle and sophisticated. What about you quietly store up pride, knowing you're better than others and you aren't getting what you deserve, and it just grows this deep, ugly character that expresses itself in you not being able to love others. The subtle, harmless, floating snares of vanity are everywhere in the fish pond of our lives. So fill yourself in worship of God. Feast on deflecting praise to Him and others where appropriate. Gorge yourself on His greatness, and you may just find yourself able to squelch the inner monster of vanity, because God will be working the victory in and through you.